Thanks everyone for coming. Look, I want to start by saying that I think that America is probably one of the most exciting countries on the planet right now to be a socialist. Maybe Sudan's a bit more exciting after the speech that we heard last night at the opening rally, but there's no doubt that we are witnessing one of the biggest and one of the most important breakthroughs and developments on the US left that I think we've seen in decades. It's one of the most exciting developments I think that we're seeing across the left internationally, and perhaps that's why there's so many people here at the meeting this morning. And obviously a big part of that is crystallised around what's happening with Bernie Sanders. Think back to 2016. Sanders ran really as an unknown senator from Vermont. He ran in the 2016 presidential election really as an unknown figure, certainly in America, but definitely in the rest of the world. He took those Democrats' primaries by storm in 2016. He popularised the idea of socialism in the States, the idea of Medicare for all, and he ran Hillary Clinton very close to the nomination in that year. In 2020, he's now obviously running to be president in 2020, he entered the race. He confirmed himself as a candidate in the race as the most popular politician in the US, as the most recognisable politician and the most popular one. So going from an unknown senator from Vermont in 2016, he's now one of the most popular figures in US politics. And I think what is really interesting about this time and this race is that it's not just about Sanders, but you also have quite an exciting and an inspiring range of new Socialist Democrat politicians coming through. People will know Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the Bronx, who scored one of the biggest upsets in Democrat primary history by beating Joe Crowley, one of the big Democrat figures in the House of Representatives. But you'll also have seen Ilhan Omar, the first hijabi-wearing member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, the first Palestinian woman to go into Congress. So what I think this shows is that there are politicians in the States who identify as democratic socialists and actually are very popular because of it. This is a big, big breakthrough. You think about the narrow consensus that has existed at the top of US politics for so long. You know, the place where to call yourself a liberal was a dirty word. Now that has been burst open. For 30 years, Republicans and Democrats have gone along with privatisation, sucking up to big companies, sucking up to fossil fuels, expansive imperialist policies and so on. Now you have a whole range of Democrat politicians who are challenging that and are really popular for it. Are popular with young people, popular with first-time voters, big followings on social media and so on. And this, like I say, has burst open what's possible in the States politically. I think it's also worth pointing out that it's rocked the establishment. The American establishment have not had to deal with the problem of socialism for quite a long time. Now they do. Look at Trump's inaugurations. Look at his State of the Nation speech in January. He pledges that America will never be a socialist country. He said it again last week. The establishment are quite rocked by this. That picture that I started with, the New Yorker magazine, when did everyone become a socialist? There's a tone of panic in the voice there of some of the American ruling class. This is a good thing for the American ruling class to be scared that socialist politics is popular again. So I think Sanders' campaign, which people should draw out in the discussion, the election of people like Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib, I think these are big, big positive developments. In some ways, though, I do think that the most exciting developments of what is happening in the US is what is happening on the ground. It's not actually necessarily what's going on in Congress, or it's not just about Bernie Sanders' campaign. The most exciting developments are what is happening on the ground, because to put it bluntly, socialist ideas are back in a way that we haven't seen in decades. There's that famous statistic that people might be familiar with, that in 2016 the most Googled word in America was socialism. It was the most Googled word in 2016. The figures that now come out is that a majority of young people in the US, a majority of millennials, favour a socialist system over a capitalist one. 7% favour a fascist one, rather worryingly. But more young people in the States are in favour of a socialist system rather than a capitalist one. And I just think it's worth thinking about that for a moment, because when you consider the importance of the US economically, culturally, militarily, you know, the dominance of the US over much of the world, when you think that in the belly of the beast, in the belly of capitalism, socialist ideas are on the rise, that is something that can make us all quite hopeful, to be honest. That is a good thing. This is an incredibly positive development. And what it also means is that we are seeing a rebirth and a growth of socialist organisation in the States that, again, we haven't seen in a long, long time. People will probably be familiar with the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA. And the DSA have existed for quite a long time. If you want to trace their splits and stuff, they go way back, 50 or 60 years. For a lot of that time, they've been quite a fringe group, really. A small number of members, a small number of people sort of campaigning in the Democratic Party. In 2016, when Trump got elected, their membership was 6,000, or 5,000 or 6,000. Now, their membership stands at 60,000. It's increased by a huge amount in that 3 years. The average age of the DSA is 33. They're attracting young people, and their attract is springing up all over the country, all over the US. And people, in the discussion, people should draw out some questions, because their relationship to the Democrats is quite interesting. But it's not true that they just do electoral stuff. Their chapters are quite active. They do anti-fascist demonstrations when the far right mobilise. They support strikes going on. Or you look at the language they use. You know, working women of the world unite. They see themselves as socialists. There's clearly some quite left-wing ideas going on in them. So I think that has been a very exciting development in the grounds. And what is really important, I think, is that you've seen the return of socialist ideas, you've seen the return of socialist organisation, you've also seen the beginnings of the return of struggle and strikes to the US. Now, I don't want to over-egg this, it's not the scale of the 1930s and so on, but there are some very exciting strikes that have taken place in the US over the last couple of years. People will have followed the teacher strikes that have taken place in various states and have been fantastic. Thousands of teachers on strike, protesting, occupying Capitol buildings, and so on. This is a photo of what's happened in LA. But the most exciting strike, I think, that has gone on in the US recently has been what has happened with the Wayfair workers. I don't know if people followed this. I think it was last week or 10 days ago, Wayfair is a company, I think they're a bit like IKEA, that was found to be providing furniture for the migrant camps at the border. You know, the camps where children are in cages and so on. The Wayfair workers discovered this. Within 3 days, they'd organised an unofficial walkout. Hundreds of workers walking out. There's a brilliant article, people should read it, on Jacobin magazine, where one of the organisers of the strikes, of the Wayfair strike, talks about it. She said she went to a meeting with the CEO. The CEO said they weren't going to listen to their concerns. She then said she got 80 people to pledge to walk out. She said she was shitting it, to be honest, when she was there at the rally. She said 600 people walked down the hill for a strike rally on the day, and taking up an incredibly political issue, not something over wages, taking up the question of racism, I thought was a fantastic, and shows, I think, the sort of insurgent mood that can be found in America at the moment. So, like I say, you look at all of those reasons, I think being a socialist there, you'd have a lot to relate to. There'd be a lot of stuff to go to. There'd be a lot of discussions to be having, and I think that's a positive thing. I guess the question we have to ask, really, is how have we got here? How have we got to this position? On the one hand, I guess the simple answer is the fact that Trump is president. With someone like Trump, a bigot, a racist and so on, it's not hard to see why people would be interested in an alternative kind of society, is it? If Trump's at the head of capitalism, you think about the confidence he's given to bigots, the abortion bans, the caging of migrant children, the taxing of the cutting of taxes for the rich, 21% tax cuts for the rich. It's not hard to see why, if this is the guy who represents the free world of capitalism, a lot of people will be interested in what kind of different world is possible. But you see, I want to argue that actually the rise in socialist ideas in the States is not just a result of disgust at Trump. In some ways, it's a result of the same processes that have put Trump in the White House. Because you see, Trump himself is a result of the polarisation that exists in the US. It's a result of the decades-long attack on working class people, the attacks on wages, the attacks on living standards, the lack of healthcare and all of that kind of thing. Trump was able to pull that to the right. He was able to, yes, blame migrants and whip up racism and so on, but also to promise jobs, to promise to open up the factories again, to promise to make America great again, and so on. And the same way that Trump has pulled that to the right, you're also seeing that people like Bernie Sanders can put it to the left and argue that the enemy is Wall Street, and argue that we need to tax the rich more, that we need Medicare for all. And people should look at the Sanders rallies. I'm not saying that Bernie Sanders is perfect. We do have disagreements with him. His position on Palestine isn't great. His support for aspects of American imperialism. I'm not saying we should forget these things. I don't think that should be our starting point, though. I challenge anyone to watch a Bernie Sanders rally to see him railing against Wall Street, demanding democratic socialism, free Medicare, all of that kind of thing. I challenge anyone to watch that and not get a bit excited. About what is happening in the States. He shows that the polarisation that led to Trump can also be pulled to the left as well. There's an insurgent mood in the US where there's a feeling that finally people like Sanders, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are articulating people's concerns about healthcare, tuition fees, student debt, the power of Wall Street, and so on. And to be honest, right, I think a big part of their appeal is that they don't look like the Democrat establishment. They don't look like the Democrats that have dominated the party for the last 30, 40 years. You think about the people like Hillary Clinton, the cabal around her, who ran the fatal campaign in 2016, but also do not get it now. They simply do not get why Hillary Clinton lost. They think Clinton lost because America has gone right-wing and that Trump was, there's more racists than progressives, and that therefore the Democrat strategy now should be to tack to the right rather than the left. This is really what the Democrat establishment are arguing. That for someone to win in 2020, they have to win over Trump voters. And that means being equivocal over abortion, or not speaking out too much in favour of migrants. People like Bernie Sanders represent the opposite of that. How else can you explain the fact that, to be honest, a 77-year-old man is immensely popular with young people? He sweeps the board with young people in the polls. A 77-year-old. How else can you explain that if you don't look at the difference between him and the Democrat establishment? And you see, it's worth focusing on the Democrat establishment because their real strategy for defeating Trump really is to focus on manoeuvres at the top. The Mueller report, impeachment. They even, talk about working with Republicans across the aisle who aren't in favour of Trump. They have no strategy for relating to the anger at the base of American society. In other words, they're clinging to the centre ground. You have people like Nancy Pelosi arguing for bipartisanship rather than serious opposition to Trump. And that's why, in the primaries at the moment, the candidate that the Democrat establishment are focusing on is Joe Biden, who I think himself is 74 or 75. He is the establishment candidate. He's a chosen choice for the American ruling class to be the Democrat candidate. And at the moment, if you look at the polls, he is well ahead of Sanders. Going into the last debate, most polls, or the first debate, sorry, that took place last week, most polls put him 15 to 20 points ahead. He's now gone down a bit, because people would have seen he's not a very good performer in the debate and got savaged by Kamala Harris, but still he's 10%, 12% ahead of Sanders as his nearest challenger. One thing that I do think is a problem for Sanders at the moment is Elizabeth Warren. People would have heard about, I think she's a senator from Massachusetts. Elizabeth Warren does have a left veneer, it's true. She does like to pose as a progressive. The thing is, though, if you look at her record, it's not a very impressive one. Elizabeth Warren is equivocal on Medicare for all. She is equivocal. She's not as firm as Sanders on it. She talks of a strong military, of supporting US imperialism. She actually has a bizarre idea about making a greener military. When asked about climate change, she said she wanted, a more eco-friendly military and atomic bombs and stuff. She also, quite crucially, Elizabeth Warren firmly rejects the label of socialist. She does not identify as a democratic socialist. She was a Republican until 1996. She was a Republican through the Reagan years. That gives you, I think, a bit of a sense as who she is. She poses a problem for Sanders, though. She's riding quite well in the polls. She's between 12 and 16%. But crucially, I think, as Joe Biden falters, there's a reason the Democrat establishment see Warren as a candidate that they can co-opt. As a safe candidate with a left veneer who they know really will protect the interests of American big business and so on. And I guess it's a long way to go, right? There's a lot of caveats. We've only just had the first debate. It's an amazingly long season, the primaries. The first voting isn't until January or February. So there's a long, long way to go, right? And the polls will go up and down. But as it stands, it does look like the American ruling class and the Democrat establishment are going to get behind Biden as their candidate. And as 2016 shows, with the super delegates, the dirty tricks, the Democratic National Committee and so on, if you have that behind you, it's quite difficult for you to lose. It's not impossible, but it is quite difficult. We have to argue that Joe Biden, as a candidate for the Democrats, would be an unmitigated disaster. It would be an absolute disaster. When you look at Joe Biden's record, you see that this would be someone who is by no means a progressive candidate. And I say this because there will be a lot of pressure in 2020 that anyone but Trump is good. There will be a lot of pressure. For the DSA, if Sanders doesn't win and Biden wins, there will be big pressure to get behind him, to stop Trump. The pressure was big in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, when we didn't think Trump could win. Trump could possibly win again in 2020. It's actually quite likely, I think. And there will be huge pressure to get behind Biden. We have to argue that is a disaster. You just take a look at his record. Joe Biden was one of the key authors and key people who pushed through the NAFTA trade agreement that decimated jobs in the US. He was a key author of the war on drugs and the mass incarceration policies like the 1994 crime bill that targeted black and African Americans. He has bragged and said he is proud about working with segregationists to prevent busing during segregation in the 60s. He was a key author of the Patriot Act and a massive cheerleader for the war in Iraq. he also recently has refused and then did finally accept to be against the Hyde Amendment, which bans federal government from providing resources and money for abortions and so on. So you look at the record of that guy. When someone says to you that Biden will be better than Trump, I think actually the answer is no. I'm not saying, look, Trump is a bad figure, and I'm not saying Biden's as bad as him, but the idea that Biden represents some kind of strategy out of the Trump nightmare, I think is wrong. I think we have to say that there has to be a strategy that can go beyond that. We have to have something more to say than just that the only way to stop Trump in 2020 is to vote for Joe Biden. I also think we have to say that if I was Donald Trump, which thankfully I'm not, if I was Trump, sitting in the White House, the person I would want to face in 2020 would be Joe Biden. I would not want to face Bernie Sanders. In 2016, Trump won by really posing as the outsider. Clinton's candidacy was not just being establishment, it was being the ruling family in the US. Trump's message of Make America Great Again was up against Clinton's of America's already great, and Trump won. He was able to pose as the outsider. To face Joe Biden, he could do the same thing. It looks like Biden's only real ticket that he's running on is that I was Obama's vice president. That seems to be his only sort of campaign thing. This is fatal when going in to face Trump. The polarisation, clinging to the centre ground, that would be a fatal decision. And I guess the question for us, therefore, is for the huge numbers of people that are interested in socialist ideas, that have joined the DSA and all the rest of it, we have to try and debate a strategy that can go beyond that can break out of the stranglehold of just getting behind someone like Joe Biden. And you see, look, obviously we're in London, right? And it's quite easy to make judgments from thousands of miles away. It's more difficult in the living, breathing movement of being involved in the US. But I just want to offer a couple thoughts and see what people think about where the movement goes and what, the big question about where this potential in the US goes. I think one thing we need to address is the question of the Democrats. Because you see, like I say, the relationship from the DSA to the Democrats is interesting. However, it's true to say that the vast majority of socialist organisations in the US now will spend the next 18 months getting behind the Bernie Sanders campaign and operating within the Democratic primaries. The main focus will be on what's happening in the Democrats. There will be strikes and campaigns and so on, but that will be the main focus of much of the US left at the moment. And I think it's worth going through what the Democrats represent a bit. They're a very strange party. The Democrats have a very checkered history. It's worth remembering that in the 1860s, the Democrats were the party of the slave owners. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it was the Democrats who were opposing it. Lincoln was a Republican. They were smashed in the Civil War, and really, they didn't really exist as a national party until the 1930s. And they recast themselves in the 1930s when the Republicans couldn't really offer a response to the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash and so on. And FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, really reinvented the Democrats as a party who were on the side of Labour, on the side of unions, on the side of working people, and also on the side of minorities, women, and so on. And this is something that changed even more in the 1960s. The big movements, the gay liberation movements, the struggle for civil rights, the women's movement, the Democrats kind of recast themselves as the party of those groups and of the party of progressive politics in the US. Despite that, though, the Democrats still remain as one of the two central parties of US capitalism. There is still a huge commitment to big business and corporations. And it's interesting, if you look at the figures of big banks like JP Morgan, if you look at their political donations, for most of them it is split completely evenly down the middle. It's 50% to the Republicans and it's 50% to the Democrats. In other words, the US capitalists, the big money makers, hedge their bets on either party. They know that whether it's Republican or Democrat, they know that both of them will do their bidding. They don't see the Democrats as more of a threat. You can't say the same here of the Labour Party and the Tories. The Labour Party, well, under Blair they got a few. The Labour Party's biggest funding comes from trade unions. The Tories comes from millionaires. The same is not true in the States. In the States, the millionaires on average, halve their donations between the two. And you see, for me, the biggest question, and I think this is what we should discuss, the biggest question about Bernie Sanders or about Ocasio-Cortez is not whether they've made dodgy statements about Palestine or praised John McCain or anything like that. The biggest question is whether they are going to use the biggest opportunity we have in decades to smash up the two-party system in the US and to smash up that stranglehold of the Democrats and the Republicans over US politics. It is something that American politics desperately needs at the moment. The whole history of social movements in the US is that they start off with a vibrant energy and they get corralled into changing the Democrats instead of changing society. Again and again, the Democrats have been a shock absorber to radical social movements and to strikes, campaigns, anti-racist movements, and so on. In the 1960s, there existed a huge potential to break free of the Democrat and Republican stranglehold, all the movements that I talked about. In the end, they were corralled behind the Democrat machine. In the 1980s, there existed a huge opportunity with the Jesse Jackson campaign. The great civil rights leader, Jesse Jackson, ran in 1984. In 1988, he came very close to winning the Democrat nomination. And instead, when he lost of breaking and trying to establish a new force to the left of the Democrats, Jackson was offered a few positions in the Democrat elite, a few positions at the top table to try and change the Democrats from within. And you see, although, right, on paper, the DSA, I think their line on the Democrats actually is quite impressive. You do not have to be a member of the Democrats to be a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. They don't. I say you have to be a member of the Democrats. Officially, their line is that they are working inside and outside the Democrats, but they actually talk about their end goal, about forming some kind of new political party. They do give some sense of this if you read their literature and so on. But you see, the reality is, right, is that a lot of energy and the main direction, if you read the stuff coming out of the DSA, the main direction it's going in is to get behind the Sanders campaign, and if that loses, the key question is what will happen. When Sanders lost in 2016, he went on to endorse Hillary Clinton. That was a sort of dead end for a lot of his supporters, I think. The people who are inspired by socialist ideas end up having to support and campaign for capitalists and imperialists and so on. And I think the big question for us, without sounding hackish about it, the big question for us, I think, is that there is a huge potential in the US. There's 60,000 members of a socialist organisation. The big question for Ocasio-Cortez, for Sanders and so on, is are they going to allow that to be corralled into the Democrat machine, or are they going to use that energy to try and put a breakthrough new force in the US that the US left definitely and desperately needs? And it's on that basis, just to sum up, I actually want to return to the tradition of someone called Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs is a big hero of Bernie Sanders. Sanders' mayoral office in Vermont has a portrait of Debs on the wall. Eugene Debs was a militant trade unionist. He led the 1888 Great Pullman rail strike. It was a nasty strike, 13 people killed on the picket line. That's a vicious strike. It was a serious strike involving thousands of people. Debs was put in prison for his role in the strike. He was sent to jail, and in jail he read Marx's Capital. And using his own words, he said that it set the wires humming in my system. Debs came out of prison, he left the Democrat Party, he became a lifelong revolutionary socialist, he was hard against racism, he wouldn't speak to segregated audience. In the 1920s, a big deal. he was hard against the Democrats, and he founded the Socialist Party of America. In 1918, he gave a speech where he spoke against US involvement in the First World War. He was imprisoned for his efforts. From his jail cell, he ran for president and got 1 million votes in the 1920 election. Not a mean feat from prison, from a jail cell. Convict number 653 for president. He got 1 million votes for the Socialist Party of America. The reason I talk about Debs is because he's become fashionable again on the US left. Jacobin magazine talk about him. Like I say, Bernie Sanders is a fan, and so on. I think it's a tradition we have to return to today, because Debs was scathing about the two great parties of US capital. He didn't actually say there were two parties, he said there were one party, the Republican Democrats. Debs had this to say: the Republican and Democratic parties, or to be more exact, the Republican Democratic Party, represent the capitalist class in the class struggle. They are the political wings of the capitalist system, and such differences as arise between them relate to spoils and not to principles. I think that is still true today. Yes, the Democrats have changed. Yes, they have progressive figures in them, and so on. But still, the Democrat machine represents one of the two great parties of US capital. And you see, I think the great task in the US for socialists still remains to found an independent organisation, a socialist organisation that breaks from the Republicans and breaks from the stranglehold of the Democrats and the Republican, that has prevented real social change coming about. And I think our key message has to be that the potential exists today to do it. The potential exists today more than it has in previous times. The support for Sanders, the support for strikes, the return of struggle, the interest in socialist ideas, the growth of socialist organisation. There is an insurgent mood in the US. It would be a great tragedy if that mood was corralled and sucked into the democratic machine, rather than breaking and founding something new that can give hope to millions of people in the US and around the world. Thank you.